So, and our guest, Roland Marconi, is the director, producer of the film Enemies of Peace, which is about to hit newsstands or to hit movie theaters all over America almost momentarily. And we're going to be discussing this film, Enemies of Peace, because it's about preventing the next war in the Middle East. And as the materials for the film say, it's a warning sign of the impending risks of escalating war, especially in the Middle East. It is based on the interviews with renowned journalists, scholars, and activists, and it talks about little-known facts. The spread of the fundamentalist view of Islam called Wahhabism is due to the West, not to something that was indigenous to the Middle East. It was something that was a product of the Cold War, and that we have a situation where Donald Trump is acting, sort of taking military matters in his own hands, which is a frightening prospect because that's exactly what fascists do. And often it leads to their disaster, their own disaster, but it also destroys a lot of the world along with it. So that's a fearful thing that he's beginning. We've heard just recently Venezuela and other places he's talking about doing this. Now,
That's right.
Roland Marconi, thanks for joining us. And you're no stranger to these studios and to this kind of work. What led you to do the film Enemies of Peace?
Well, I've been seeing just a lot of skewed reporting in predominantly the mainstream or corporate media, and it's really been kind of disheartening because the American people don't really understand what's going on there. All they know are like 30-second news blips that they hear, and they're not getting the full story. So I've been watching and listening to some great journalists who have been doing excellent reporting on the issue, and I decided to pull some of them together. Some of the best, like Max Blumenthal, people like Abby Martin, Stephen Kinzer, to really explain, the background, some of the history, and what all the ramifications are into this militarized, foreign policy that's just kind of on steroids right now.
Right. So these are interviews. You went out and did these interviews. You found these folks, and how did you choose who to have as your guests?
It's really been on just the merits of the reporting that they've been doing, and they're really not getting a voice in the mainstream media. So I thought, it's up to independent journalists. I've been doing independent video and TV news for a long time. So I thought it's up to us to really help each other in getting the voices out in whatever ways possible, whether it's YouTube or social media or wherever, to just get their voices out to kind of counterbalance what's going on in the mainstream.
We have a clip. We're going to play a couple of clips. And the first clip, can you describe what we're going to be hearing first?
The first clip tells a little bit about one of those, as we call, enemies of peace, which is the Saudi Crown Prince. And he's been behind a lot of course, behind the whole war in Yemen. He's been the one who's really pushed that and brought it to just a catastrophic state that it's in now. So this is kind of some background of him. And he was just recently in the country, just on a PR tour, kind of getting buddies with all the corporate.
Driving. Women can now drive in Saudi Arabia.
Oh, yes. So human rights, as far as that goes, minuscule.
But what's happening in Yemen right now? Yemen is
a catastrophe. There's one of the worst famines in modern history. There's a cholera epidemic. There's a blockade of any of the humanitarian funding that's coming in. And the U.S. is arming and supplying logistics for the Saudi bombing of Yemen.
All right, so let's hear a clip now from the film Enemies of Peace.
Mohammed bin Salman came to power. He has initiated a more aggressive Saudi foreign policy with the aim of dominating the Gulf region. Beyond the wars in Syria and Yemen, the Saudis are now threatening military action against Lebanon, Qatar, and most alarmingly, Iran.
The Saudi Crown Prince and his kingdom spend a lot of money on lobbying. So they have PR firms in the United States and all over. They have done the greatest spin on this Crown Prince, who is responsible for the Saudi murder of so many people in Yemen is the reformer.
He wants to sell himself as a reformer. He's younger. He's done small things, like he allegedly is going to let women drive. He's going to open movie theaters. But in the scheme of Saudi human rights abuses, that's pretty small change. The Saudi regime internally cracks down viciously on critics. So you'll see things like public beheadings. You'll see the death penalty for people who have criticized the regime. Even the so-called anti-corruption crackdown was done without due process. And although a lot of the people who were rounded up were no doubt corrupt, so is Mohammed bin Salman.
Part of his modernization would appear to be to want to ratchet up the conflict between Saudi Arabia and the other Gulf states on the one hand, and the Islamic Republic of Iran on the other hand.
And so that was a clip from the film Enemies of Peace, and the producer and director is here, Roland Marconi. Roland, can you tell me, so that's sort of going into what you were saying earlier about sort of duplicity in this alliance that the United States has with the Saudi Crown Prince, where basically what they're saying is Saudi Arabia is doing the dirty work. They're fighting a proxy war on behalf of the United States, basically.
In large part. I mean, a lot of it is for their own benefit because they want control of basically the whole Arabian Peninsula. And so they've had this war, in addition to the United Arab Emirates that's been heavily involved with that. Yeah. And but the Saudi Crown Prince, he was just on a tour. He was in Hollywood. He was making deals.
So he's
with
a darling of the media people of America. He's our darling. He's supposed to be the young, new guy who's going to liberalize and make it okay for the U.S. to be allied with Saudi Arabia, despite this murderous attack that's going on against Yemen.
Yes, and historically it's been a lot about oil and oil resources in the region and supplying the U.S., but now the Saudis are the primary funders of think tanks and foundations. So they are spreading their influence throughout the media, throughout all kinds of foundations.
So are we talking about sort of like what's at the heart of the history behind this? Because you go in this film, Enemies of Peace, you go into not just the circumstance that exists, but how we got to this situation.
Yes. Well, as far as how we're involved, we
being the United States.
We being the United States, we've been funding and supporting coups and wars there for a long time. And what looks like is the next step, as was kind of laid out in the Project for New American Century, is to go after Iran. Mm-hmm. So they went after Iraq.
So you see
Syria,
a war developing,
and that's what we're looking at as the next step is a war with Iran. So the Saudis are even teaming up with Israel on this, of course, with the UAE, and there's sort of a proxy war, although it's gone beyond that at this point in Yemen. But that's what they're lining up this alliance against Iran.
Now, there are, surprisingly, I've discovered in doing this kind of research, is that there's a lot of people on the left who had such a distaste for the regime change policies of Clinton and Obama that they actually claim that were exaggerated. Progressives who oppose or see a sort of a fascist direction in Donald Trump's actions are not being realistic, that in fact he's not. It's a lot of talk and nothing's really happening as far as a huge U.S. mobilization towards war, which you saw, let's say, before the Gulf War or something like that.
Well, if you look at all the U.S. bases that are in the Middle East, there's basically a ring around Iran of dozens of U.S. bases, and they're in basically every country in the region. In fact, in Saudi Arabia, in Qatar, there's a base, but the Qataris are actually kind of trying to calm things with diplomatic means, and now the Saudis are even going after Qatar and wanting to dig a canal in between your countries, which is insane. They boycotted the whole country. So any region that, including Lebanon, that tries to maintain a neutral aspect is now getting marginalized and is put on the defensive.
Right.
Just for that.
So this is what you're saying. This is what's happening now in the Middle East is that is the most recent iteration of what's been happening for a long time. That it's not just Trump, but all the presidents and leaders up till now have brought us to this point, and now Trump is in charge, and his rhetoric is dangerous rhetoric. I mean, by anybody's.
Yeah, he pulled out of the Iran nuclear deal, which every other country in Europe is just, not sure what to do about that.
Yeah.
And he's been funding and providing weapons, record numbers of weapons to the Saudis and other forces in the region, including in Syria. We're involved with 6 or 7 different conflicts at this point. So Trump is now surrounded by a cabinet full of generals. Mm-hmm. And even they are trying to temper his, bizarre rhetoric, unfortunately. But that's not.
Well, does that tie into the whole thing of there's some adults in the room in the army and different places who will, hold back Trump?
Well, it's kind of a double-edged sword. Some people think that, but it's kind of a hallmark of despotic authoritarians to surround themselves with a military junta. And that's what we're looking like
right,
more and more each day.
And so the folks who are supposed to be reining him in might actually be exactly what they seem to be, a military junta.
They may be planning all of these things.
Right.
Fact.
So what is, again, more about Enemies of Peace? How long has it taken you to get this far, to get to...
Well, it is kind of a newsy type of documentary, so I was trying to keep it as current as possible, and only been working on it for about 6 months. And I hope to do updates and actually develop it into a series as well. But things are moving so fast that it's difficult to kind of keep tabs on it. But a large part of it is how the media is covering this issue, but also how a peace movement can be kind of revitalized and be brought back into the public consciousness.
Right. So that's what is the goal then of a peace movement? Is that what it is? What's the goal of this film, Enemies of Peace? What would you like to see come from it?
Well, really to stop our funding, military funding of these rogue countries that are just going after.
But do you think
everybody.
that's possible on its own, if that's just going to happen?
But it's also our country itself. We're the ones who are behind most of it. Mm-hmm. So it's really there was some legislation introduced by Bernie Sanders and Mike Lee to stop funding the Saudi war, and it didn't pass. But they got a number of votes for it, which is the first time ever anybody's ever voted against Saudi.
So you think there's a change
funding.
that there's a change bringing the wind as far as Trump is going in one direction, that there's millions of Americans who might come out and protest.
Yes, and it's also the whole issue of militarism and the money that's being wasted and abused, really, in the trillions of dollars. We don't even know how much money is involved. The latest figures show about $21 trillion that's gone missing since like 9/11.
Really?
Yeah. And so it's great and it's hopeful to see the organizations like the Poor People's Campaign that are adopting this anti-militarization campaign. Code Pink, of course, has their a campaign to defund militarism.
I watched Ray McGovern get dragged out of hearings and things like that. Right? We have to have him on his show. So Roland, let's go on. What is another? We have another clip coming up. Which number clip is it?
Well, I think number 3, the think tank.
And what is this?
There's a number of think tanks and foundations that more and more are being funded by these foreign governments. And everybody talks about, Russia influencing our elections and so forth, but nobody really talks about the Saudis, the UAE, Israel. They are the primary funders of most of the think tanks and foundations in Washington. And they're basically running and funding all of our representatives.
Very interesting. So let's listen to this clip, and then we'll be back in a minute to talk about it.
How much of America's foreign policy is influenced by the vast amounts of money flowing into the coffers of our political leaders and the many think tanks and foundations purporting to operate in the public interest? The amounts we know of are astronomical, but perhaps just the tip of the iceberg.
The UAE funds the think tanks actually more substantially than Saudi Arabia that are pushing Mohammed bin Salman's line. Yusuf Otaiba, who's the ambassador here in Washington, is one of the most influential, maybe the most influential diplomat in Washington. And he has basically carried out a public relations campaign on behalf of Saudi Arabia through the Harbor Group. But it's Saudi Arabia that's kind of footing the bills in many cases. And, you know, one hand will wash the other. And so when you talk about human rights, when you talk about condemning countries for killing civilians and sanctioning them, Saudi Arabia and UAE are behind the biggest humanitarian catastrophe, but they also support a who's who of think tanks here on K Street. Center for American Progress's largest donor, I think, is the UAE, and that's the Democrats' main think tank. So you're not going to hear about that. And they're very sophisticated. Yusuf Otaiba is very sophisticated. He works both sides of the aisle. A few months ago, Otaiba oversaw an event at the Hudson Institute, which took place at the Reagan Library. Steve Bannon was the keynote speaker, and Bannon is being brought into this Saudi UAE network, someone who is considered an Islamophobe and a white nationalist. Why is Bannon being brought into it? Because Bannon has put forward a Muslim Brotherhood ban in the U.S., and that would basically drive the main Muslim civil rights group, CARE, the Council on American Islamic Relations, out of business. CARE at this point is really supporting the Qatari-Turkish line in the Middle East. And so you not only have Iran versus Saudi Arabia, you have Saudi Arabia and UAE versus Turkey and Qatar, who really represent the Muslim Brotherhood's bases of power across the Middle East. And Egypt is the bulwark right now of Saudi Arabia, but they're fighting over Egypt. And the fight is taking place right here in Washington, where the main Sunni Muslim civil rights activists are really supporters of the Turkish-Qatari line.
So at the end of the day, it doesn't matter what Trump is saying, what anyone really says. What matters is this bipartisan foreign policy agenda and consensus throughout Washington that does not stop and start with the President of the United States. I wouldn't call it the deep state. I would just call it who the players are who are really running the show, who's funding the senators and congressmen, who's funding the people at these think tanks. Because it's easy to look at congressmen, senators, and the think tank operatives and say they're running the show. They're all fighting the factions of the deep state versus the neoliberals versus the neoconservatives, but really, who's on top of them? Who pays their salaries? Weapons contractors, the banking establishment, and oil and gas giants.
Well, that was very interesting, and interesting perspective where they're talking about a bipartisan agenda in the United States. It's not really a Democratic or Republican agenda.
Oh yes, they're nonpartisan,
Yeah.
And that was Abby Martin at the end talking about more of the corporate funding,
Yeah.
and Max Blumenthal before that talking about the foreign influence on the think tanks. And so it's those two forces from within the United States and from without that are really pouring millions and millions of dollars every year into lobbying groups and think tanks and foundations that would shape the narrative that the media puts out, that shapes what legislation comes up and what they're even willing to vote on in the Congress. So if we want to talk about influence on our
I do,
electorate.
and we're speaking with Roland Marconi. I'm Paul DiRienzo, and the host, and we're talking about his film Enemies of Peace, Preventing the Next War in the Middle East. How can people see this movie when it finally comes out? When's it coming out, and where can people see it?
We just did a screening a couple of weeks ago in Manhattan. We'll be doing another in Brooklyn. There's one schedule coming up at the end of the summer in L.A. So there'll be some screenings in different areas, and we will make it available online probably within the next month. probably on Vimeo, that people can just watch the whole thing and share wherever, and YouTube as well.
Now, folks have been saying, I know that there's other Killing Gaza was a recent film that Max Blumenthal was involved in. I saw the other week. I mean, these great things, this information is coming out, even this show and other shows and these networks that we work with. How do we know really that we're reaching beyond the converted? We're just talking to in a big echo chamber to ourselves.
Yeah, it's really difficult, and that's why, I mean, the alternative media has been very marginalized in most of the outlets, and now with net neutrality under threat, that's going to be even more the case.
Where they can actually charge more money for people to get access instead of being, tell us, what does it
right,
mean?
or even bump your content that's not approved of by whoever down to lower pages and further. They back page you.
They back page you, so when you search on Google or different places, it won't come up.
Yeah, so it's Google, it's Facebook. They're on the forefront of controlling what's
well, this seems to be the
media.
response to this whole, I'm not sure about this Russian collusion story, myself. I've seen it seems in a lot of ways like a big nothing burger.
Yeah. Well, I think a lot of it is, and a lot of it is kind of covering up who's really influencing our government.
And not Guccifer 2.0?
No, not that one.
I'm waiting for Guccifer 2.0 to show up again with a new leak.
And all you hear, even on the so-called left media, is that Russia attacked us. Attacked us. But meanwhile, all the funding that's coming from these few countries in the Middle East greatly surpass anything that Russia could ever hope for. Even just look at and Russia is even posed it as our primary military enemy. So William Hartung,
even though they're one-tenth the defense spending is the United States.
Not even that. William Hartung, who was in the first clip, pointed out that Russia's military budget is about $81 billion this year. Our military budget increase that was just voted on is $82 billion. So it's less than even the increase from that brings it up to $716 billion this year.
It's just been going up and up and up.
Yeah,
2 years ago, it was a record-breaking $600 billion 2 years ago.
Right.
I know, so now we're well over $700 billion.
And then there's the part that we don't even know about, the black budgets. So who knows how much?
Well over a trillion.
It's got to be over $1 trillion.
Well over $1 trillion, I'm sure. So what is this heading to? Is this some 21st century version of the balance of power that the restructuring of the world that led to World War I and the subsequent bitterness that seeded World War II? I mean, we're going into another.
Yeah, well, there was a plan. There was a project for New American Century, and there were others similar that are talked about in the documentary, that they've been wanting this control over the region. The U.S. wants control over the region, and so they've found allies in the Saudis and in Israel, primarily the UAE, to kind of work with them to sort of secure a dominance in the region. And of
Do you
course,
think that's what's happening? Is there a possibility of war, of a serious, like, lots of people killed war, more bigger than these little brush fire wars that are killing plenty of people, but like where armies are put in, and like the old Gulf War, the invasion of Iraq, or things like that?
Well, that's what they're planning with Iran, and John Bolton has promoted this. He's suggested we start bombing Iran. Other people in Congress have as well, and people in Trump's staff. And this would be a complete disaster. It's not like Iraq. Iran has 80 million people, and they are willing to fight, for their sovereignty.
Right. They would see it as a straight-out invasion, like Vietnam or something like that.
Yeah, and they are well armed. They are determined. They've been through wars with Iraq before, and they won't just stand down, and it would be just a huge mess, if not like a World War III situation.
So it seems like there's a there's something. The U.S. almost seems desperate for all its money and all its power and all its military. They're acting almost like they're afraid of losing their space or their position, and that they're desperately trying to keep control of it in a crucial area of the Middle East.
It would seem that way, and they have their sort of proxies and their countries in the region, either to instigate something or to provide cover for, we have to back our allies kind of thing.
Yeah.
So that's what's really kind of scary.
Right. And, do you touch on in the film at all, because I haven't watched it all the way through, but the domestic, what will happen to protesters, to people who disagree with these policies here? I mean, what could we face?
Well, I don't get into that too much in the film, but it is really kind of a numbers game. It's really a matter of people getting involved on every level and supporting the media, the independent media that's
Sure.
really telling the truth, but also getting out in the streets, because we see with issues such as the immigrant children. We see, other issues like that, the women's rights issue that people
They're rolling back.
People get out into the streets and they really support it. But a lot of those are responding to Trump's personality or his tweets or his specific policies. But there's larger things, at the same time that everybody is concerned about the children, which they rightly should be. There's a military budget that just went through with Republicans and Democrats voting on it. They're cutting back social services.
Right.
They're attacking Social Security.
We see that every day.
Food stamps. There's all kinds
work
of
requirement for elderly people to get their food
They're
stamps.
destroying the unions. The Supreme Court is getting twisted and skewed. So there are all of these things that people should be out on the streets for as well.
All right. Anything you'd like to add, Roland Marconi?
Just that we need to have everybody involved and support. There are many peace organizations. There's Veterans for Peace, World Beyond War. Action Corps has been sponsoring a lot of the protests in support of the people of Yemen. Just look for the people that you believe in and trust in the media.
Learn about places by watching films like Enemies of Peace, Preventing the Next War in the Middle East. Learn about places. Go outside your comfort zone. Learn about places you might not have even known existed, because those are the names that will be the headlines.
Yes, we hope so. That's our goal.
All right, Roland Marconi, thanks for joining us on The Torch. Glad to have you on, and I really encourage folks to see the next screening of Enemies of Peace, and keep track. We'll keep people informed on our website when they can get it on the internet and watch it themselves.
Yes, and you can always go to enemiesofpeacefilm.com for more information there.
All right.
And thank you very much.